Yes. So welcome to all of our alumni and my fellow Highlanders. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Roberta Watson. I may look like a new face if you've joined us for our formal digital career conversations, and I serve as the program manager for student relations here in the Office of Alumni Engagement. A little bit about me: I work with a student-led organization called the Student Alumni Association, and we work together on connecting alumni with students and providing professional development opportunities for both. So today we have just some information on events coming up for us. I want to do a little plug. This fall we have our annual Career Exploration Conference in Health and Medicine on October 27th. And then later on in early November, we have a dinner with alumni, which will be focusing on the sports industry. So if you're a student or if you're an alumnus that wants to come back and get involved either as a panelist or just to network and learn from our other alumni speakers, feel free to visit our website. That's saa.ucr.edu, and you can find more information and the registration links there. So now, before we begin, I would also like to encourage you to go to the alumni website, that's alumni.ucr.edu, to check out further career information. So Louise has our career guides, including ones on resumes, cover letters, and more. So definitely go check those out because they're very useful. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's Mastering the Job Search. Our first panelist is Bernice Maldonado. Bernice is a proud alumna of UCR and provides talent development, professional image coaching through her practice Growing Forward. She has served as an organizational and change management consultant and has an intimate knowledge of recruiting and talent development from inside organizations. As a first-generation student and professional, she's committed to ensuring young alumni get the high-impact career coaching they need early on to ensure their professional success and career growth. Bernice is also one of our preferred coaches of the Alumni Careers Program. Our second panelist you'll be familiar with. Her name's Louise Jackson, and she is the Director of Alumni Career Services and Young Alumni Engagement here in Office of Alumni Engagement at University of California, Riverside. Since 2009, she has worked to help career advancers and job seekers understand, clarify, and advance their professional goals. She has a Master of Arts in Education and Career Development from the University of Michigan, and Louise is certified as a Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and the Emotional Intelligence Inventory. She also has reviewed close to 1,000 resumes along with LinkedIn profiles, helping alumni to identify and improve their career brands and online visibility. So with those bios, I'm going to begin today's session with some questions for our two panelists. At the end of the series of questions that I have for them, we encourage you to type in any questions you may have, and we'll definitely try to get those answered towards the end. So with that, I'd like to open the first question to Bernice. It's a bit of a general question. So how can a client of UCR alumni get the most out of a coaching relationship? And Bernice, it looks like your mute is on.
Sorry about that. And I did remind myself to unmute, but I forgot. Thank you everyone for joining today. Really appreciate you taking the time out today to join today's session. I think it'll really be helpful. And again, as mentioned, please think about questions that you have, and we will certainly answer those for you today. So as far as a coaching relationship, there are actually several things that someone can do to improve that coaching relationship. I think the first one is to do some upfront work before you even contact or meet with the coach. Some of that upfront work that you can do is self-assessment. So looking at yourself, looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, and even taking self-assessment, online self-assessment tests or other tests that are available through the UCR career center that you can take to kind of just get insight into more about yourself, like the MBTI, etc., to kind of, prepare yourself and really do a self-assessment before you meet with a coach. Even if you've done them in the past, I think it always helps to kind of revisit them as well, because we do evolve and change over time. So it's just interesting, and also to see some of the growth that has occurred since the last time you did a self-assessment. Some other things too is to make sure that you're in the right mindset, that you're clear about why you want a coach and what your goals are in getting a career coach. Also, I mentioned mindset as well. I think you have to be open and prepared to get very constructive feedback and ready to also grow from that feedback. So if you're not ready for that, think about, what you need to do to get ready, because in my experience with career coaches in the past, they give very, very constructive, honest feedback. So you have to be prepared to listen to it, to kind of reflect on it and take action on it, depending on that feedback. Some other things too is when you do decide to take on a career coach, I think it's important to be ready to meet with them, not only to make sure that you're going to make adequate time for any of the assignments or work that they give you, but also be on time to the meeting and make sure you make time for those coaching meetings. And then last but not least, I think you have to be ready to engage during the coaching relationship. Be honest and transparent about what your strengths are, your weaknesses. Career coaches know that we're not perfect, so make sure that you're comfortable to share some of those weaknesses and some of those areas where, maybe you've made a few mistakes, or just be generally ready to ask for help where you need it. So I think those are some of the key things that I could think immediately about what would improve or what would help with a coaching relationship.
That's some great advice. So our next question is for Louise. What's the difference between a career coach and a placement professional? Oh, and Louise, it looks like your mute's on.
So me and Bernice have the same challenges. But it's a very good question. And I think for our job seekers, it's worth really understanding that a career coach is very different from a recruiter or a placement professional. The question I like to ask myself, or even ask our audience, is, and as crass as this sounds, who's paying? So in other words, who's the client? In the job seeker coaching relationship, the client is the job seeker, and obviously the coach is the person providing that service. So whether that's giving them career branding, resume, LinkedIn advice, helping them prepare for a salary negotiation conversation, helping someone prepare to interview by preparing a mock interview practice and things of that nature, are all things that the coach is able to do. They're also able in some cases to provide that assessment. They may be certified in some of the career-based assessments, such as Career Leader, Strong Interest Inventory, Strengths Finder, and so can give you that assessment and then help you interpret that feedback, and from there determine your strategy. So that would be the coach's primary role, is to give you that assistance. Conversely, if you ask the same question that we started with, who is paying? In other words, who's the client? When you think of the placement professional, the recruiter, their client is actually the employer. In other words, the employer, IBM, Google, the University of California, Riverside, for that matter, is paying, whether it's internal or an external recruiter, is paying an individual to help them make a placement. That is the client relationship. So the job seeker, as they try to enter that relationship, needs to recognize that they actually are not the client. Mm-hmm. The client is the employer, and they are securing the services of a placement professional. That being said, a recruiter may provide some career coaching assistance to a job seeker. But I think it's helpful for our job seekers to recognize that that is not primarily a career coaching relationship from a client service provider perspective. The recruiter would only do that as a way to help finesse the job seeker so that they are able to then make that placement. But again, their client is actually the employer. So asking yourself that key question about who the client is helps you figure out there's services that you can expect in that relationship. And I think it's very helpful for all of our alumni and our job seekers to understand that that's going to be different for a career coach versus a placement professional.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. The next question we have is a bit for both of you. So how might a coach assist me in figuring out my career goals is the first part of the question. And the second is, what process do they follow? So feel free to jump in on those questions.
Sure. So I'll go with the first one. So how do career coaches help with career goals? I think, first of all, I think it's important to, for yourself to kind of be prepared and think about what some of those goals might be, because ultimately the coach shouldn't really be held accountable for determining your career or your career goals. I think you kind of have to come prepared to talk about what your interests are, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, because if a career coach doesn't have good clarity on your goals, then they can't really help kind of set that plan, that personalized plan for you. They can certainly give you insight into your interests, into, and again, using some of those self-assessment tools that will certainly give insight to both you and the coach about some possible goals. But again, I think when you do start that coaching relationship, I think it's important for you yourself to have some idea around those goals. So then the career coach can then use those goals to develop a personal plan for you. So again, I think those are the two key things as to how they can at least contribute or add clarity around your career goals is number one, using what your thoughts are on your goals to develop the plan, and secondly, giving you that extra insight or other tools to help you get clarity on your career goals.
Great, thank you, Bernice. Anything you'd like to add, Louise?
I think, Bernice definitely touched on a number of the key things. And I think what we have seen over the years, and even in some of the work I've done in emotional intelligence training, is that really the key determinant of the success is you. We know that obviously a coach can help you. They can help you identify blind spots, things that you may not be aware of that are inhibiting your career success, your promotional success. But ultimately, the agency lies with you. And I think the minute the job seeker takes that upon themselves and recognizes that they are the determinant of their own future, then the coach can step in to really assist. I won't take up too much time, but I would encourage you to consider or even look at our website. When we came up with a model for our career job seekers, our alumni out there, we defined our model with the following tagline: define, brand, network, grow. And I think that really identifies the key phases that the job seeker needs to go through. So they need to define their career goals. They need to understand themselves. They need to build out their branding. They need to have a solid online presence. They need to have that strong communication, whether it's in their resume or their verbal communication. They need to have a strong networking strategy. We have networking guides, and they need to have the grow piece would ultimately be that placement piece or that salary negotiation. There's various things in there, but those are some of the key phases. We know that real life is very messy and doesn't always work in neat little steps like that, but I think a coach can really help you work through those phases and help you systematize some of your thinking around building out a strategy for each one of those phases. So what will it look like to build out a networking strategy? And if you have further questions about that, I'm also happy to assist and take those later on.
Great, thank you, Louise. With that, I'd like to transition into different phases of your professional career, and there are several career transitions within that. So our first question is going to be for Bernice. Say a UCR alumna is just graduating and moving to San Francisco to be closer to her boyfriend. Can you give some advice on how to start building a professional network in her new hometown?
Sure, there's actually a few things I think that can be done. First is kind of reaching out to your existing local network and finding out if they have any, contacts or anyone that they could recommend that you sync up with in the new town. So that's number one, and it can be either personal friends or professional relationships as well. Secondly, I think it's important to perhaps think about joining professional organizations or associations that are in that area. that are either related to your industry or even complementary to your industry. So that second is, just joining some of those groups and, attending some of their events, and related to that, networking, both online and offline. So just going out to some events that are, again, industry related or even complementary, that you can join and meet new people. So off the top of my head, those are a few things that come to mind. But always immediately, I think it's helpful to start with, people that you already know and that they can recommend as well. So those are a couple of things that I think would help in that situation.
Those are fantastic. And I would just, again, plug the Alumni Association. Definitely
Yes.
check out different events they have regionally, as well as digital events where you can network.
Thank you for bringing that up. That was one too, and I completely forgot. Yes, definitely reach out to the alumni that's in that area as well.
Definitely. Thank you, Bernice.
Yes.
Now here's another situational question. This one's for Louise. If a UCR alumnus is trying to transition from a career in event planning to marketing and struggling to get his foot in the door when his title draws more attention to events rather than marketing, how would he appeal to job seekers?
So again, going back to the model that the coach would help you identify, in other words, we talked about here at UCR, we have the Defined Brand Network Grow model. You would take each aspect of that overall development plan and figure out each of those stages for the job seeker. So in his case, we would do most of our work in the branding and the networking. And I would say branding, considering how you can start to build a brand around marketing and less around events. I find that on LinkedIn, a lot of people use the tagline to identify themselves by their job title. I would suggest steering away from that and rather going with a professional identity that really allows you to highlight your professional brand. And so in this specific case, that person would, if he even has done some marketing work, identify himself, as a marketing professional versus, as an events planner. So trying to sort of really wrap your mind around speaking to the future. And again, if you have some experience, but it isn't part of your actual formal title, that's okay. So you're starting to build out that professional brand. So doing that on LinkedIn, doing that in your resume, for example. Sometimes, alumni and clients look to something like a functional resume, which allows them to draw more attention to their skill set versus a chronological way of arranging their work experience. So some of those might be suggestions. If you would like some template for a functional resume, you can take a look at our resume guide. So that would be some advice I would give from a branding perspective. From a networking perspective, I would encourage our alumni to I don't typically recommend books, but there's a really fantastic resource written by Steve Dalton. He is a career counselor at Duke. He really helps identify a very step-by-step strategy to networking that I find for our job seekers that are somewhat struggling, that have sometimes a more challenging scenario. He helps break it down into actionable steps. So opening up Excel, drafting that list of potential organizations. Are there alumni there? Are they currently hiring? Using Excel to identify then a list of 5 to 10 organizations. We know there are alumni there. We know they're currently hiring. And then systematically reaching out to those individuals by writing approach emails, tracking that in your calendar. Everything is really, sometimes when we're demoralized, we just need, an action item. Tell me what to do. And so that 2-hour job search really helps to identify some of those steps. So I would encourage our alumni to take a look at that. And that would be something that I would encourage this job seeker to do.
Great. Thank you so much for your response on that, both of you. So our next question directly pertains to our advice for first-generation professionals. So this one's going to be for Bernice. Say I have a degree in marketing from UCR and come from a family where most of us are in construction or agriculture. So I am a first-generation student. I'm really struggling to figure out how to prepare myself for the job search without my family's support. I have not heard back from the applications I've submitted and feel like an imposter. Any advice for that new grad?
Sure. So I actually am a first generation professional. For those of you that are not familiar with that term, it's kind of a little bit of a new term. You may be familiar with first generation students, but similar, first generation professional is someone who is first in their family to hold a professional career. So like in my case, both of my parents were labor workers, assembly line workers, and one of my first jobs was in a bank. So when I did start looking for a job, I couldn't really go back to them for guidance or any kind of advice on resume or anything like that. So I definitely can relate to this question. But even when you're a graduate, definitely there's a lot of pressure around that. And I would advise that if you are in this situation is to definitely not get disappointed because your family can't give you that guidance, but more look for other people to help out. I think that's one thing that I did not do as well early on is asking for help, because often I felt a little embarrassed or shy to kind of ask people for help because I was always so used to doing everything on my own, because again, my parents were somewhat limited in some of the things they could provide. But in my case, I would highly advise you to ask for help, especially now with LinkedIn, et cetera, where it's much easier to kind of ask for help, not only ask for help, but also meet people and kind of see their backgrounds and meet people that way. So that's number one, is don't be shy about asking for help outside of your family. Secondly, again, as I mentioned before, is kind of joining some of those professional associations, those organizations, reaching out to UCR alumni to get that support as well. You'll often be surprised as to how many other people might be in your same situation. So again, building kind of that little community that you can rely on and kind of just use as, you know, to share your accomplishments, to share your challenges, just building that support group that understands and knows where you're coming from. Those are a couple of things you can do, but definitely ask for help. Don't get disappointed with not being able to get that guidance at home. There's always people who are willing to help. And recently I've been working on a project and reaching out to people to get help on portions of it. And I was just, again, so surprised, not really surprised, but it was very encouraging to see how many people are willing to help you when you ask for help. So definitely that's the number one advice I can give about that.
That's great. Thank you so much. So our next set of questions are going to be around returning to the workforce. So I'm going to ask this of Louise, but Bernice, feel free to weigh in. We'd love your input on it. So the first question is, I've taken several years off to be a stay-at-home parent, and I'm ready to venture back into the workforce. What should I include on my resume?
It's a really great question. And, I know that a number of women, this is something that is relatively common for them. They may take some time off to be with their families and then return to the workforce. This reminds me of a client that I worked at in my previous employer. And I remember being very impressed. This specific client had taken a good chunk of time, I would say 12 years or more, of work to raise a family, and was now trying to get back into the workforce. Had been at a director level for a marketing organization, but felt very strongly that they did not want to be apologetic about the fact that they'd taken this time off. And I remember being very impressed that this specific person felt strongly not to apologize. And I think that's something that not only women, but even potentially first generation professionals may have the sense that we need to apologize for having, for whatever reason, this gap in our formal, and I say formal intentionally, in our work history. So, not necessarily apologizing, being willing to address the matter head on and explain why some time was taken off. And then during that time, I think, and again, it's harder retroactively, but during that time, making sure that there's, whether it's volunteer opportunities, smaller projects, doing those, staying, if you're trying to get back into the same field that you were in, fields definitely change. marketing is, for example, constantly at the cusp of new things. AI is changing everything. So making sure that you're keeping tabs on what those changes are in your industry is very important. So that would be something that, I would do. I would suggest when it comes to branding, again, using some of the volunteer experience or the small project work that you have done in your branding documentation, in your functional resume. I would very strongly advise using a professional summary in a resume. The professional summary really allows you to draw more attention to what I would call your career brand, your theme, versus a chronological without any kind of professional summary. That also allows you to identify a professional identity that may not necessarily, again, be your title. So I wouldn't suggest trying to be funny and saying you're the CEO of your household. I mean, I know that's cute, but again, you're trying to get into marketing. You'd want to have a marketing professional identity listed in that professional summary. I would encourage you to look at our resume guide where we identify those 3 components of a professional summary. So for example, you would say, marketing professional with skills and background in, leading, a team of 5 to 10, something like that. And then the skills and background followed by the results of value proposition. So in order to improve, program awareness, et cetera, and, return on sales or something like that. So again, you've got a value proposition, you've got those 3 components, and then you get prepared in the interview to address that question of, where were you for the last 12 years? And so being prepared to answer that is also very, very important.
Great. Thank you so much, Louise. Anything you'd like to add on that, Bernice?
So somewhat similar to what I mentioned earlier is it could also help to attend some networking or professional association events, and you get a chance to talk to other people and just get intel and just, ask them what's going on or what are kind of the newer technologies or trends that are going on, and just be honest, as Louise said, is, just let people know you've been out of your planning to return to the workforce and you're just interested in finding out what changes have occurred. And people are totally open to that, to talking about that. That's one thing. And then the other thing I was thinking about too is maybe just, I personally know some people who have returned after a while. And I think it's just important to kind of also take care of yourself and your image. So it would be important just to make sure, to go out and maybe just buy a couple of, a little bit of a wardrobe that makes you feel confident. It makes you feel, that's going to make you feel confident, make you feel really good about kind of coming back to the job first couple of weeks. So that's also important to just to, make sure your wardrobe complements your professional identity. So that's the other thing I would say too. Make sure you take care of yourself as well. So I know returning back can be very stressful and it could take a lot of time, but remembering to take time for yourself as well is also really important.
Great advice there. Okay, so our next question is another situational question. I'm considering selling my tech startup and trying to switch back into an industry position. Can you give me some career guidance and how to make this change? Louise, would you like to start with this one?
Sure, but I'll jump in, and obviously Bernice, I'm sure, has some great additions to add as well. So I would say, the first thing, again, going back to the original model that we identified, is making sure that the push and pull factors this individual has thought through are really well thought out. I found with career transitional seekers, in a lot of cases, there may be a lot of push. When there's a lot of push factors involved, that's really where the individual really needs to think through whether this is the right move for them. On the one hand, you don't necessarily stay in a position because you're scared or because it's negative. But on the other hand, there needs to always be some push, but also a good amount of pull. In other words, what is pulling you to consider this potential option? And I think that's where, in some specific cases, there may be only push and not a lot of pull. And so this specific individual needs to really think about, okay, what's pulling me to this option? And really have thought through what that means to them. I think that would be my first suggestion, making sure that there's enough pull factors involved. I want to go for this because, and be able for them to really identify what those are. The second thing is I would encourage, and I know in the entrepreneurial space, there's a lot of networking going on, but I would encourage this individual to start with a strong networking strategy. Again, like I'd identified in the previous response, referring to Steve Dalton's 2-hour job search, something very similar, where they would systematically be reaching out to individuals who work in more formal employment that they're looking to get into. Informational interviews can be a really great way for you to find out more information, gives you a chance to make connections, to find advocates who then can boost you, either connect you to someone who is hiring, or even, you know, maybe they're hiring themselves. So informational interviews are really very, very important. And I would encourage our alumni to consider informational interviews as a great aspect of that. I would also then want this individual to consider transferable skills. So, you know, again, going back to that branding, what are the skills that you've acquired in your work as an entrepreneur that might be transferable to this position? So I know entrepreneurs are accountants, they manage their own taxes, they do pretty much everything, all their own marketing. So pulling out what those are and using that in their branding documents would be something that I would also suggest.
Those are some really great actionable items, I think, for our viewers. Bernice, would you like to add something to that?
Actually, I don't have. Louise covered some of the thoughts I had.
Yeah.
Don't have any additional to add to that.
Great. Okay, so we do have a question from one of our viewers that I'd like to get answered before moving on to a few more. So one of our viewers wonders, after graduating from college, where can she ask for help to revise her resume? Louise, I know if you want to take this one, and then any additional advice from Bernice would be great.
Absolutely. There's a lot of potential options for you. I would say the first one you probably want to look at is if you're within a year of graduation, you still have access to the Career Center. So while the Career Center formally focuses on students, if you're again within that year of graduation, definitely take advantage of accessing the Career Center. They have a full team of career counselors who do resume review. That would be something I would encourage. If you are already outside of that year, you have a couple of options. The first one would be a paid for service with the Career Center here at UCR. That would be one. The second one would be through your membership in the UCR Alumni Association, you get a resume review. So that would be your second potential option. So again, if you're outside of that year, the Career Center, or you could get a membership in the association, UCR Alumni Association. Again, that's alumni.ucr.edu. Purchase that membership. One of the benefits is resume review. And then obviously there's all kinds of other options. There's our preferred coaches like Bernice, who are experts in this field. Again, it's a paid for option, but they do provide discounts to UCR alumni. So that would definitely be worth exploring. You also could start to access your alumni network. So I would say alumni are just all over. Many of them are going to be experts in the field you're trying to get into. So let's say we've done a lot of marketing. Let's try something else. Let's go with you're a developer. So I would say if you're a computer scientist, a developer, and you're trying to get into that space, how about looking at the UCR LinkedIn alumni tool and finding other developers out there, reaching out to them and asking them if they may be willing to give you some advice. So that would be something else that I would consider doing.
Those are really helpful, and I think some great resources we have here at UCR. Bernice, is there anything from an outside career coach that you would suggest in addition to that?
Well, other than also a career coach, as Louise already mentioned, providing you some of that feedback, I think the other option would be hiring or paying someone like an external company to do a review. I've had mixed experiences with that. With one, I think I ended up kind of redoing my own resume. So I think just being careful about it. If you do hire an external, if you do decide to go that route, just understand that you may have to try a few to get the result you're looking for. But I definitely agree with Louise's recommendations on first starting with UCR and that route. And again, it just depends on what your preference is, but definitely another option is to go externally, but understanding that you may have to try a few, and the costs vary. They can be very expensive as well. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have just a couple more questions that we have for our panelists. So I want to encourage you again, if you have questions for our speakers, please make sure to get those in so we can get those answered within our time limit and get you off before 12:45. So this is kind of for both of you again, so I'd love your input on this. How is current employment market with low unemployment affecting job seekers?
Really great question. Bernice, defer to you, and I'm happy to jump in. I think the job market right now is pretty hot for job seekers. Not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
I actually, Louise, I actually agree with you. However, I have kind of limited insight in that. I think what I'm aware of is more of I'm in the more consulting industry. I also have my own business as well, which I think is going well too. But as far as from what I have seen in the consulting industry and those kind of related industries, they are really looking for people that have kind of just that consulting kind of approach where you can kind of look at problem solve, and make recommendations on how to improve a company's effectiveness or people performance of that company. So again, I'll just make that note that my insight, as far as I know and amongst the people I know, is that yeah, it's just, I mean, right now they don't seem to have a problem with the job market. They all, consultants and employees, they don't, like you said, Louise, I don't see problems with it. However, I think it's very industry dependent and also geographic based as well. It depends on where you're at, what your industry is, and also sometimes what your degree or background is as well. So that's my kind of limited insight on that.
I would say, yeah, exactly like Bernice said, there's going to be a lot of variation across individual cases and across industries. And in some cases, it's hard to draw correlations between the individual case and, you know, these overall trends that we're seeing in the job market. That being said, I'm trying to think back. I do know that right now in the Inland Empire, you know, for job seekers, again, this is a larger trend, but unemployment is at a low, which is good. In other words, there's less competition for job seekers when it comes to applying. On the other hand, I don't work extensively with employers, but UCR does have employer relations with a number of employers. And strangely enough, you know, some employers say, well, you know, we're still not seeing what we're looking for in terms of job seekers. And again, that's a very broad generalization. But again, going back to the question we mentioned earlier about individual agency, a lot is going to depend on the individual case. I would say, while you might be able to say, wow, the job market is really hot, I have all these options, I could negotiate because I'm going to get 3 offers and I could pick and choose. I would say, okay, that's good. Hold your horses. Let's really make sure that the message that you're sending is one of competence, professionalism, that you really are prepared to meet the needs of that employer. So on the one hand, it's good to be confident. On the other hand, you need to make sure that you really are what the employer is looking for and you're addressing their needs. Sometimes I see with our job seekers so sort of intent on what they are looking for that they kind of forget how to frame that in terms of what the employer is looking for. So that would be some suggestion. And again, a little bit off topic, but similar to what you're saying, Bernice.
Great, thank you both for that. I'd like to move it to one of our viewer questions. So she wonders, after a job rejection from HR, she sent a follow-up email which included that she would love to still work for the company if any future opportunities opened up. Should she connect with the HR rep on LinkedIn? Feel free to weigh in on this, either one of you.
I'm happy to jump in. I think Bernice probably also has some thoughts. You know, I would say that most recruiters, their world is LinkedIn. They're constantly on LinkedIn. So it depends on the size of the company. And again, it depends on the industry of the specific organization that we're talking about. If the organization is very small and the recruiter, you know, it depends. Are they only doing recruiting, or is their role some recruiting but a good amount of other HR responsibilities? in that case, I may be more hesitant to say connect with them. On the other hand, recruiters who are either independent recruiters or internal recruiters for large firms, and I'm talking Google, etc. There, I think connecting with them on LinkedIn would be fine and would be perfectly appropriate, given that this is again their realm and where they are. So they, the minute there's activity there. But I would caution that by saying you definitely want to personalize that outreach. When you click connect on LinkedIn, I warn our job seekers, don't send the "I'd like to connect with you on LinkedIn," because that's not going to get the response you're looking for. You really want to, if you're going to do this, do it properly. So customize the outreach, tell the person who you are and why you're trying to connect with them.
And anything to add to that, Bernice?
Yes, I agree with Louise. I would also say that if you do reach out to them, definitely and I would advise this for any person that you reach out to on LinkedIn, is to add that personalized note, because people want to know why you're connecting with them. But in this specific instance, yes, definitely personalizing why you want to connect with them. And maybe it's just sending them a way of thanking them for the opportunity to interview with them, and you just want to stay connected in case future opportunities open up that are more aligned to your skill set. And also understand that if they don't connect back with you, don't take it personally. They may have either some personal or professional rule to not connect with candidates. But I don't see any harm in sending them a thank you note, as I mentioned earlier, for taking their time to interview you. But again, don't take it personally if they don't connect back.
Great. Thank you so much for helping answer that question. Our next question is from another viewer, and I'd like to pose this directly to Bernice. So, are there any tips for seeking an overseas job besides networking, as you had mentioned through LinkedIn? And go ahead with that, please.
Oh, sure. So I think it's very important to get information and understanding of that culture, not only of the country's culture, but also of the work culture, because there are times where it can be very, very different, and you need to make sure you go in with an understanding of that. And also just a general understanding, just stepping back a little bit, because there are a lot of companies that are international companies that maybe have a base in the United States, but they also have offices or other, maybe their headquarters in another country. So it's very important to understand the differences amongst those different geographic cultures. I remember I worked with a woman who was a senior person at an international company, and she had been selected to do a kind of stretch goal or kind of a larger project in a different country or the headquarter of that company. And she was just telling me about how different the culture was over there. Not only, of course, the country culture, but also the work culture. It was completely different from the US culture. The other thing she made sure to do as well is try to speak or learn the language as much as possible. She said she wasn't going to be able to learn it, that quickly, because she had never spoken that language before. But just getting familiar with, what are some of the key or, some of the most common language or words that are used. So she made sure to do that. She hired a tutor to come and help her with the language. So she did a lot of things really to make sure she was prepared. The other thing too is if perhaps you're taking family with you, then it would also be important to prepare them as well, so that they don't feel like they're being completely, dislocated or taken out of their comfort zone. But I think overall it's getting familiar with that culture, and also being open to a new experience, because there's going to be a lot of new things that will be taking place. So being in that right mindset again.
Great. Thank you so much, Bernice. Anything you'd like to weigh in on that, Louise?
Yeah, Bernice's advice is spot on, I would say. And again, it varies based on the country we're talking about specifically. And there's a great book out there that I have used in the past in my work with international alumni or clients. It's called Bow, Kiss, and Shake Hands. I found it very helpful. If that would be helpful to the job seeker, might be worth looking into that. I think understanding how job seeking is different in other countries is also helpful. And again, it's going to vary by culture and by country. I would say that outside of the US, the standard protocol is to submit a CV versus a resume. CV is a very different document. So doing your homework about how a CV is different. It's a longer document, tends to be a little bit more all inclusive of one's work history. A resume tends to be very thin, brand driven, and tends to be shorter. That's not to say that a CV doesn't involve also a lot of work, but I think considering that and then working on that lengthier document is also very, very important. I think it's important to also consider that countries may have various different legal parameters that they're working with. For example, they may have more outright affirmative action requirements or things of that nature that are worth thinking about. So as a job seeker, knowing that some countries that is, in writing and how you might approach that is going to vary. So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head for the job seeker there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So it looks like we have hit that 12:45 mark. So please join me in thanking our panelists for being with us today. It was a pleasure joining you, and we really appreciate all of your insight and advice for our listeners today. A reminder to all my fellow Highlanders, a recording of today's session is going to be sent to you via email. And if you're interested in checking out any of the former digital career conversations, please go to the UCR Alumni YouTube channel and you can go and watch those back. And we'd like to invite you to participate in next month's digital career conversation on November 13th, where the topic will be negotiating your job offer. This is going to be great for professionals at all different stages in their career. We hope to see you right back here. Thank you again for joining us, our speakers and our viewers, and have a great rest of your day.